Thank you and hi. Thank you all so much for joining me today. It is, of course, the first day of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and what better way to spend it than by talking a little bit about an intersection that's too often underexplored, and that's the intersection of stalking and intimate partner violence. My name is Dana Flightman. I'm the Senior Training and Awareness Specialist at Spark, the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource. And I'm excited to be chatting with you all today. It's great to see people introducing themselves in the chat. I see we have everything from campus professionals, probation officers, a wide variety of folks. So we know it takes all of us to recognize and respond to stalking. So thank you all so much for joining and giving some of your time today. So Spark is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. We are the technical assistance provider on stalking. And what that means is we're here to help the helpers, and y'all are the helpers. And so we have a ton of stuff on our website at stalkingawareness.org. For all the practitioners I've seen mentioned here in the chat, we have resources for victim advocates, for probation and corrections, for prosecutors, for law enforcement, for campus professionals, for victim services, if I didn't say that, for judicial officers, and awareness educators. And more. So we have so much stuff on our website. I'll refer to some of it today, and my colleague Emma is here to share some of those resources in the chat, but please do check us out. We have a lot more kind of nitty-gritty guidance there on our website. All of it's free, and you can just go click and download it right away. We also have training modules. So if you or your partners do any kind of awareness education, if you're talking about, say, healthy relationships, you're talking about bystander intervention, you want to be talking about stalking as well. That's something that can be integrated within an existing program and or stand alone as its own program. And so we have both options for you on our website, free training modules with scripts, slides, videos, activity ideas, so that you can get folks talking stalking without having to reinvent the wheel. We also have discussion guides on all 4 seasons of the TV show You, and lots of ideas there that you can grab and go. We have victim resources, so we are not a direct service provider, but we know that victims come to our website for information, and we know that victims come to folks like you looking for information on stalking because there is no stalking hotline, there is no stalking crisis center, right? And so we try to create resources that you can easily share with them. For example, these brochures on understanding stalking, we have these in English and Spanish. And you can put your local information here. So if you have something to hand your survivor of domestic violence, sexual violence, make sure you have something for your stalking survivor as well. We also have handbooks in 10 different languages that you can just print, posters for around the office, infographics, fact sheets, and lots more. And webinars like this one. So if after today you're like, I wish I could hear Dana talk even more, you are in luck, my friends, because we have an archive of recorded webinars, and we're called Spark. So I got us to call it the Sparkives. So that was like the height of my career. So you can check us out in the Sparkives anytime. And we're also on social media. Our handle on there is at Follow Us Legally. If you get our sixth sense of humor at Spark, we are not scared. We want you to follow us, and sign up for our newsletter. As an anti-stalking organization, we will not contact you excessively or without your consent. So you have to actually opt into our newsletter, and it's one we send around quarterly. So I really hope that you will connect with us and keep stalking top of mind year-round. So why are we talking about this today? Well, of course, these crimes intersect, and it's also a good time to remember that stalking is one of the 4 crimes under the Violence Against Women Act, right? It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, but it's always kind of like, and stalking. Like we almost called our website andstalking.org because so often it's an afterthought and it's like, oh yeah, we kind of cover that. It's sort of in the mix with other things that we do. But the reality is that stalking is dangerous, it's prevalent, it's a standalone crime and victimization, as as well as one that often intersects with intimate partner and sexual violence. And yet it's very under-discussed and under-resourced. Like I already said, when you think about it, there's no national stalking hotline. There are few, if any, standalone stalking crisis centers. So it really falls to folks like you who are often primarily focused on and have a lot more training and resources around intimate partner violence or perhaps sexual violence to kind of add stalking on. And I'm not saying that's fair or easy because you're already busy and have plenty of work to do. But I am saying it's really important because these survivors really have nowhere else to go. And so, look, you're the ones doing the work every day. You know how to do what you do. My hope just by the end of the session, you kind of move that and stalking a little more to the beginning of the sentence and see the work that you're already doing through that lens with a few new tools, ideas, strategies, and with a heightened sense of the intersections of stalking and intimate partner violence in particular. So, why learn about stalking? Well, stalking is a really important thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So, stalking is criminal. It's a crime across the country at the federal level in all 50 states and US territories. It's a crime on most tribal lands and in the military justice system. It also violates our student conduct codes on campuses and is a reportable offense under the Clery Act, often covered under Title IX. And so every state and territory has a different statute to make it fun. We actually have a interactive map on our website you can go to find your statute, which I highly recommend that you do, as it's always good to know what your local statute is. But often folks don't realize that stalking is a crime, and further, that there's anything we can do about it, that they're not calling the police and saying a crime is happening. And so we want to recognize this is a crime across the board. And it is traumatic. Many stalking victims experience both physical and mental health issues that can be short-term to lifelong, particularly anxiety, insomnia, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you think about what's maybe a little bit unique to stalking is that sense of anticipatory fear, that sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. We have stalking survivors feel like that sometimes for years. In fact, the average duration of a stalking case, not the high end, the average duration is 2 years, and 10% of cases last 5 years or more. And on average, our intimate partner cases last the longest. And so you can imagine the kind of hypervigilance that often results and the kind of chronic stress from feeling that sense of looking over your shoulder for sometimes anything from an afternoon to an entire lifetime. Many lose time from work. 1 in 8 lose some time. And stalking victims, about half of those lose 5 days or more. Stalking victims are not always a protected class of worker. And so that's something good to look up in your area. They might lose their jobs entirely. And many relocate. This really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Even if you're excited about moving, it's stressful, it's expensive, it's not something you do because someone's kind of annoying you. We have 1 in 7 victims relocating to get away from these offenders, which I think helps to illustrate how traumatic this victimization can be. Always good to hear from survivors in their own words. Here's one who said, "It's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." And I like this quote because it illustrates what so many stalking survivors have said to me, the sense that it's never really over, that I knew the day probation or parole ended, they'd call me, and they did. That, oh, it's the anniversary of our marriage. We've been divorced for 10 years, but I know I'm going to get a creepy card in the mail. And they do. That sense of rather than a traumatic event they can heal from, that this person can always come back and so often does, and they can never truly move on from it and feel that it's completely done. And stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including but not limited to rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to directly harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicides, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that homicide or attempted homicide. And yet, so often these stalking behaviors are dismissed and minimized as, oh, it's just texting, it's following, someone put a tracker on the car, it's annoying, it's inappropriate, but no one's really getting hurt here. And that's simply not true. In fact, this wonderful researcher we work with, Patrick Brady, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. These behaviors and tactics adding up and escalating over time. Now, I'm not saying every stalking case escalates to the point of homicide, right? That's not accurate. What I am saying is that every week we see cases of violence, attempted violence, homicide, attempted homicide, and at that point, responders start looking backwards and saying, oh, look, there's this whole stalking victimization here. Often that was reported to multiple sources, but was not handled with the urgency needed. In fact, the most common use of the criminal justice system prior to attempted or completed intimate partner homicide was reporting partner stalking. And yet this is often not handled with the urgency that it needs. And so we don't want to do that, right? We don't want to wait for violence and look backwards and say, oh, turns out there was stalking the whole time. No, we want to identify the stalking while it's happening because this is one of the few crimes where early identification and intervention can help prevent further trauma, violence, and possibly even homicide. And so we really have a responsibility to see the urgency here to recognize stalking, whether it's a standalone victimization and or one that is co-occurring with intimate partner violence, and to take action with some urgency and really see the stakes here are quite high. So I'm saying stalking's so bad, we have to do something. Well, what is it exactly? Of course, depends who you ask, right? There's our behavioral definition. That's what I'll be talking about today. There are statutes in every state and territory, which my colleague Emma shared in the chat. So definitely look up your statute. And there might be policies at a certain organization or agency as well. And so, again, you want to really know all of these because our behavioral definition might be the same as your statute, or it might be broader, and that can be quite confusing. So, for example, on campuses, the campus definition matches our behavioral one. So if you're working with a student, you might be saying, this is stalking, we can adjudicate it on campus as stalking. And if you go down the street to law enforcement, this may or may not meet that statute, right? That's confusing. And so know both. That being said, I'm going to focus on the behavioral definition today because that tells us what stalking really is and what stalking really looks like. And for my criminal justice folks on the call, I know sometimes they feel frustrated by that because they're like, I don't care what this is behaviorally, like conceptually, can I charge it yes or no? But I'd argue that even if you are somewhere with a more narrow statute than what I'm about to explain, you still want to know when stalking is stalking, right? You still want to call stalking what it is when it's happening so that you can respond with the right level of urgency and connect victims to the right services and help them identify what's going on. If we don't call it stalking, we miss that. So we still want to know what's happening in terms of the behavior. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others, or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So to break that down a little bit, it is a pattern of behavior that's not a single incident or one-off event, and that's called a course of conduct in most statutes and policies. So you might hear me use those terms kind of interchangeably today, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm talking about the same thing. It's two or more behaviors that make up that pattern. There are a couple states that require 3 or more, but behaviorally and in most places, it's 2 or more. And those behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking you because I'm the worst presenter ever, okay? So maybe Monday, I text you, Tuesday, I'm mad you didn't respond. I smashed your headlights. Wednesday, I feel kind of bad about that, so I send you flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors, right? So stalkers often combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, like that property damage, with other behaviors that may not be criminal on their own, but can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. And so if we look here at some of the most common stalking tactics, you'll see there's quite a range. Many include that unwanted contact, right? And so these numbers, by the way, it's the percentage of victims, female and then male. So most are experiencing unwanted phone calls, approaching and showing up in person, following or watching, um, sneaking into home or car and leaving a sign of their presence. That's a really common stalker tactic that there's no one stalker pathology, but I think speaks to kind of this desire to cause fear because many victims report that the offender didn't take or break anything, but just left some sign they had been there so that the victim knows they can get to them anytime. And so we see some offenders use technology, some stalk in person. The majority do both, and most victims are experiencing multiple tactics. And so one of the challenges here is that our system is not set up for a course of conduct. It's set up to be incident based. And so when your victim is telling you about, say, their smashed headlight, they may or may not think to automatically disclose to you, hey, I think I know who did this, and they've been texting me a lot and I've been getting weird gifts in the mail, and my phone's been acting weird. I think they hacked in there, right? They may or may not just automatically share that with you because, oh, that's not what we're talking about. But it needs to be because it's letting you know this is not an isolated incident. This is part of a bigger pattern of behavior. This could actually be a stalking case. And so, too often, different incidents are reported to different parties, our law enforcement thing over the county line, something else, victim service provider, prosecutor, and no one's connecting the dots and seeing this is a course of conduct. This could actually be a stalking case. So I really encourage you to zoom out and make sure you're getting that full course of conduct, including acts that are crimes on their own, as well as others like those excessive phone calls, showing up, etc. That could be part of a stalking case. And so stalking is a pattern of behavior and it's directed at a specific person. And so stalking's not random. It's not, for example, a peeping Tom looking in the locker room at whoever happens to be there. Stalkers are choosing a specific person or persons and targeting them. Now, that being said, we often see what we call target dispersion, which is maybe you have a stalker stalking, say, their ex-partner. Ex-partner starts dating someone new. Okay, so now they're stalking their ex and the ex's new romantic interest, right? And we know our stalkers are trying to get access and information about their victims, so they're likely to reach out to a victim's family, friends, relatives, housemates, neighbors, really anyone, right? And so a lot of folks can be involved and even considered co-victimized in a stalking case, but we still see that as directed at a specific person because they're trying to get to that victim and they might use other people to do it. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really important to understanding stalking. Stalking isn't about being annoyed or frustrated or irritated or wishing someone would stop, though all those things can certainly happen in a stalking case. Stalking is about fear. Um, so it's not, and so fear and or emotional distress. And so fear of what, you might be thinking, and this is where statutes vary. Certainly fear of bodily harm, right? That's in most statutes as well, but we also include fear of emotional distress or suffering emotional distress. And emotional distress, if you look it up, it'll say something like distress that is emotional in nature. So it's really not that helpful. But when we're talking about emotional distress, we're really also talking about fear. We're just recognizing that fear may be of outcomes in place of or in addition to bodily harm, right? You might be afraid of losing custody of your children, of your new relationship being sabotaged, of never having a moment alone again. So people experiencing emotional distress generally feel that they cannot live a normal life because of the interference from the stalker. They feel that they're under surveillance, that their life is being invaded, that they're being sabotaged, that they're being threatened. The best quote that I saw about it was a victim who said, "It's like he's taken my life without killing me." So that sense of I cannot live a normal life because this person will continue to show up, to interfere, to threaten, to intimidate me. And so that is stalking as well. And so again, stalking comes back to fear. Um, but fear is tough because fear is very personal, right? What's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. So we're going to watch this very quick 5-second video. Think about which of these folks you identify with more. Yep, that's it. So some of you might have felt more like the lady in this video, in which case, I'm sorry. Someone the other day was like, where was the trigger warning on this spider? So if that's you, I apologize. But my guess is for so many folks on this call who have heard and seen so many terrible things in our field, this face left here on the screen might be resonating a little more. And we can get where this guy's coming from, right? It's like, ugh, it's this tiny thing. Calm it down, lady, right? But what if I told you that the same woman had been bit by a spider last year that looked just like that, had a terrible allergic reaction, went to the hospital, and almost died? Will we still be making this face at her? Hopefully not, right? Because what did I give you there? The context, the backstory, right? And context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in a stalking case because a lot of times what's scariest to a victim or survivor may seem benign or even kind of nice to an outsider. Um, and so what you really want to do is respectfully ask some follow-up questions. Ask the victim questions like, what message did that send to you? What's the story behind that? Because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic, albeit an extreme example, is an offender like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you. And so the victim gets flowers, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, oh, that's so nice, because they don't know about that specific meaning. And so it's context that makes stalking scary, and it's context that makes stalking stalking, because generally no one thing is stalking. It has to be that how are these different behaviors and tactics adding up, right? And also, it's criminalizing otherwise non-criminal behaviors. It's not generally a crime to send someone flowers. It generally is a crime to make a credible threat to kill somebody. So when one means the other, we have to do some digging because this is how stalkers get away with their behavior. They are sending threats that our victims receive loud and clear, but to an outsider doesn't look like much. And so you have responders saying, well, flowers aren't threats. This is nothing. Well, yeah, not always, but they can be. And so we need to be listening to our victims and getting the full story to understand what's going on. And for our folks supervising offenders, also important to think about when we're setting those terms, around, say, if there's joint custody and there's some kind of, contact, et cetera, like really thinking broadly about different ways our offender might be getting to our victims and trying to really limit that communication, recognizing that they might do things that seem innocuous, but that our victim does not receive that way and that they didn't intend that way, but they can claim they do, right? The reality is if a victim's afraid or in distress, even if it doesn't make a ton of sense to you at first, they probably know something you don't. Right, there's probably something scary going on that we haven't been able to figure out yet. And so we're going to watch the next few seconds of this video and see how it plays out. All right. So obviously a very silly video, but we don't want to be that guy, right? And this is what happens in our stalking cases quite a bit, where you have a victim in a lot of fear and a responder saying, it's just a few text messages, you're overreacting, it's not a big deal. Who was right the whole time? It was our victim, right? She knew something we didn't. She accurately assessed the risk. So there's no better risk assessment than a victim's own fear. If a victim's afraid or in distress, they probably have a good reason. But is it fear? So in that video, we can tell that lady's scared because she's literally jumping and screaming. But as you already know from your work with victims and survivors, that's not always how they present, right? We know victims respond to trauma differently. Some might seem really, really sad or really flat, have no affect at all. And we also know there's a lot of minimization, right? There's a fear that responders will minimize it, and unfortunately, many do. But victims often minimize what's going on themselves because of the messages they've received about stalking. And so the way they articulate their experience may or may not sound as urgent as it really is. Um, so, so long story short, I mean, your victim's probably not going to come in and say, hey, I'm experiencing a course of conduct directed at me. It's causing me fear. I believe you called that stalking victimization, right? They're unlikely to say that. And it's also quite a vulnerable thing to say, I'm feeling scared. We're more likely to mask that under, I'm annoyed, I'm frustrated, I'm irritated, I'm worried about, right? So it's up to us as responders to be really thinking, could this be fear? Could this be stalking? And to kind of fight through that minimization and the other terms and not wait for our victims to bring up the term stalking themselves. Some do, but most will not. Uh, just an example of that minimization, I was talking to a law enforcement officer who shared this example with me. They were the regular point of contact for a stalking victim, and they called to check in. The victim's in a really good mood. The victim says, today's a great day. He's only driven by my house 10 times. And the officer's like, what are you talking about? That is a nightmare. It is 9 in the morning. And the victim said, oh, but usually by this time he's driven by like 25 times. So I think it's going to be a low-key day. So it's not that this victim's unreasonable, right? But she is responding to repeated trauma by normalizing what to most of us would be really scary. And that's where behaviorally that reasonable person standard is kind of helpful, because if your victim's saying, oh no, it's fine that they follow me, they're in my accounts, and they occasionally smash my windshield, as long as they don't bother my kids, right? Kind of take a step back and be like, is it fine? Or would a reasonable person feel fear? And you've been so experiencing this traumatic situation for so long that it's become normalized. I often think of an analogy here too in terms of how victims present. Like, let's say you're driving somewhere really important and your car breaks down. So when that first happens, you might be really mad. You might cry, you might yell, you might punch the seat, oh, and then you call AAA. And by the time they show up 3 hours later, you're like, yeah, broke, missed the important thing, right? Your affect may not match how serious it was. Because you've already had to explain it so many times, because you've had to sit and wait for help, because you're exhausted, right? And so we want to remember that with our victims when we think about what is the urgency here. They may not present as this is super urgent, but we need to really listen and be thinking what's going on and get that full scope conduct. Another helpful way to assess for fear, if our victims aren't saying, I'm scared, or even if they are, is to ask them what they've changed as a result of the victimization. Because I've had victims say, oh, I'm not scared of them or anything, but I changed my account. So, I blocked them on Instagram. I stopped using Snapchat. I changed my phone number. I stopped sharing my location. Finances spent on safety devices or accommodation. So that could be something like I bought a Ring doorbell so I could see if they come to my home. Or I was driving home, I saw them parked outside my apartment, so I stayed at a motel and here's the receipt. Increase security or privacy measures. Those could be what I already mentioned, as well as things that create distance. I changed my routes to and from work. I asked to switch shifts or to not answer the front desk phone anymore. I had my internship take my photo off the website. And financial impacts, so including employment consequences, identity theft is often part of a stalker's course of conduct, and damaged property. I had to lose time from work because I'm going to court trying to get this protective order, or I'm dealing with the repairing this damaged property, right? Frankly, the fact that they're talking to you as a responder means this is worrying enough that they're spending some time trying to resolve it. If someone was just annoying, right, I wouldn't go through this. So I've had victims say, like, oh, I'm not scared of them, but, I changed my phone number. I changed my routes to and from work. I changed the locks. I bought a new like Ring doorbell, and I don't take the public bus anymore just in case. Okay, well, again, those aren't things you do when someone's kind of annoying you, right? That indicates a higher level of fear or distress. So ask about these accommodations. These are really evidence of fear, and often witnesses can corroborate these, right? Like we had a daycare saying, we never used to hear from this particular mom. Now she's calling 3 times a day saying, make sure no one else picks up my kid. That's an evidence of fear. And so we want to be considering all that. All right, so stalking prevalence and behavior. Stalking is an extremely prevalent victimization. In the United States, nearly 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience stalking in their lifetimes. And people of all genders experience stalking, absolutely. This is the best available national data. That's why I'm presenting it to you this way. So the numbers here are very high, very similar to those around intimate partner violence. And we know our sexual minorities experience even higher rates than our heterosexual folks, particularly our lesbian women, gay men, and especially our bisexual women experience really high rates of stalking. So we look at our victim and offenders. Often our media shows them as strangers in an alleyway, but as I'm sure y'all already know, that is not accurate. The majority of the time, our victims know our stalkers know our victims. And a large percentage, at least in plurality here, are those current or former intimate partners, which is our focus today, right? Almost a third of the time for our male victims, over 40% of the time for our female victims, that stalker is a current or former intimate partner. It's an extension of power and control, and I'll talk about that in more depth in a little bit. So that's a big piece of it. And again, it's our focus today. But I also want us to zoom out and look at this in context because a lot of our response to stalking comes from domestic violence. And that's not wrong, but it is incomplete because most of our stalkers are not domestic violence related, right? That's a big piece of it, 30–40%. That means 60–70% are something else. Acquaintances, it could be a brief encounter, like, oh, I think I saw them at that party, or they work at that coffee shop. It could be a stranger, though it's relatively rare, a family member, or a person of authority. That could be a supervisor, academic advisor, immigration officer, law enforcement, someone with some kind of power over that victim or survivor. So again, while our focus today is on intimate partner relationships, I encourage you to also consider how your agency and your partners are identifying and serving all victims of stalking, because that's one significant piece of it, but it's not the whole picture. People of all genders experience stalking, like I said. Women are more likely than men to experience it, and the majority of victims report the offender is male. That's true regardless of the victim's sexual orientation or gender. And many of the, excuse me, the majority of victims report the offender's male. Yeah, again, regardless of those different things, regardless of the details about that victim and offender. And that's true almost 80% of the time for our female victims and over 40% of the time for our male victims. And some of that's that target dispersion I mentioned earlier. Say you have an ex-husband stalking an ex-wife, she gets a new boyfriend. Now that ex-husband is stalking the new boyfriend as well, right? And so we do see that's not all men stalking men, but that is a big piece of it that also falls under acquaintance. So even though it's not intimate partner stalking, it's motivated by intimate partner violence and power and control. So speaking of intimate partner violence and power and control, let's talk more about the intersection of how these victimizations overlap. So when we look at our friend, the power and control wheel, which my guess is you've seen before, um, of course, this is highlighting different ways that our offenders might use power to control their victims, right? And so I point this out because often in our field, when folks talk about stalking, they usually talk about it like this. They'll say something like, it was an abusive relationship. Our victim left, and from the day that victim left, our abuser began stalking them. And that can happen, absolutely. But let's take a step back. If during the relationship, our abusive partner is texting them constantly, showing up at work, showing up at school, putting a tracker on their car, damaging their property, following them, asking friends and family where they are, that's stalking, right? It's intimate partner violence. It's what we might call emotional abuse and or digital abuse and or coercive control, right? And it is those things, but it's also stalking. And that can happen during or after, but folks often don't call it stalking until after the relationship's over. And I think our victims sense this because when you ask victims their perception of the stalker's motive, power and control is the motive over half the time, right? That sense of entitlement and power and control that we associate with abusive relationships and intimate partner violence is also what our victims are perceiving to be motivating our stalkers here as well. And again, it can happen during and or after a relationship. Over half the time, it's happening during the relationship itself. But folks don't call it stalking then, but they should because we want to know when they're stalking at any point in an abusive relationship. Because while all stalkers can be dangerous, on average, our intimate partner stalkers pose the greatest threats to their victims. They're the most likely to be threatening and or violent. So why? Why do you think that is? If you can tell me in the chat, why would an intimate partner stalker generally be more dangerous than, say, a stranger or a brief encounter? Any ideas? Saying they know your schedule. Yeah, access. They know more about you. I think that's exactly right. That access and that information, their knowledge and the access that they have helps them to scare their victims, right? It can be very practical in terms of I know their schedule, I know their mom's phone number, so I can call and say, "Hey, I'm so worried. Have you heard from them? Where can I find them?" I might know their passwords or I can guess them. I know their friends and family with our entwined social networks, right? And I know what will uniquely scare that victim, which is what stalking's all about. It's so personal, right? Because who knows what pushes our buttons better than our intimate partners, right? And so if if you hated the spider in that video earlier, guess who knew that? Your intimate partner, right? Because they know that you're afraid of spiders. So now when it's time to stalk you, it's spider time. Not spider time for me. I don't care about spiders. They're going to come after my pug, right? They're going to come after what I care about. And often our intimate partners have that access and information to really get victims where it hurts and to reach them more readily. And so, again, all stalkers can be dangerous, but generally, the closer someone is or was to a victim, the more threatening and violent they tend to be. And that's why you see the numbers follow in that way, right? Our intimate partners, they're the closest, they're the most threatening and violent, all the way to public figures that are most likely to be stranger offenders, stalking a celebrity. They have the least access, the least information. Now, that being said, these are kind of general, but I wouldn't get too hung up on these categories. And here's what I mean by that. Like the term intimate partner, no one uses that besides us. right? No one's like, oh, come over for dinner. You've got to meet my new intimate partner. Like, that's not a thing. And we have a lot of relationships where people might say, oh, we're just friends, but we hooked up a few times. Or that's my ex, but we're friends now. Or we met on a dating app, but we didn't really hit it off romantically. Is that an intimate partner or an acquaintance? Honestly, I don't really care. I care what is the access or information this offender has about this victim and how committed do they seem to be to that course of conduct, right? So we want to consider that regardless of the victim offender relationship. Our intimate partner stalkers are the most likely of any kind of stalker to approach in person, to be interfering, insulting, and threatening, to use weapons, to have their behaviors escalate quickly. And while the recidivism rate is high across the board, it's particularly high for these intimate partner offenders. This is another study illustrating this. It's a study of women with protective orders. So all the women have been abused. All of them have protective orders. Some were abused and stalked. The women who were abused and stalked had higher rates of all the harms listed here. Everything from verbal abuse and degradation to serious threats, physical violence, sexual violence, threat with a weapon, attack with a weapon, and injury. So when there was abuse and stalking, higher rates of all these other harms as well. In addition to sexual harm, about 1 in 3 women stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted by that partner. And it's not only penetrative rape that our victims are experiencing. That same study around women with protective orders found when they were abused and stalked, they also had higher rates of sexual degradation, verbal pressure. If you look at like forced substance use, it's almost 4 times as high, right? And so stalking is an indicator that there are other kinds of intimate partner violence and sexual violence going on here. And the homicide connection that I mentioned right at the start today. In the vast majority of intimate partner femicides, there's stalking the year prior to the attack. Here's a more recent study reinforcing this, that stalking is one of the top 10 risk factors for intimate partner homicide. It is a threefold increase in that risk. And so when we see stalking in an intimate partner violence case, whether it's during and or after, we want to flag that. We want to say, hey, this is stalking, and that indicates to me there's some urgency here, and that this victim is likely experiencing other harms as well as an increased risk of lethality. If we just call it emotional abuse, we miss that, right? We miss that indicator. And stalking makes it even harder to leave an abusive relationship. So our victims of intimate partner stalking have more separation attempts than our victims who aren't being stalked. And that makes sense because, I mean, you might have heard that statistic that it takes an average of 7 times for a victim to leave an abuser. Well, what's that about? Not always, but often it's about stalking. That continued access, that continued contact, creating more barriers, sabotaging our victims, making it even harder for them to leave. And I think sometimes it can be easy to think, okay, well, so it's technically stalking, but the problem is really the violence. And our victims are actually telling us something different, that victims were more likely to try to leave a relationship when there was stalking. That was a more powerful indicator than prior abuse history and firearm history. And so I'm certainly not saying any of these harms are better or worse than any others, but I'm saying our victims are telling us that this, even within an experience of also being physically harmed and firearms and all of that, that the stalking is uniquely traumatic as well. And so, long story short, too late maybe, ask about co-occurring victimizations. Absolutely ask your stalking survivor about intimate partner violence and sexual violence. But if you're working with a survivor who's coming in primarily as a survivor of domestic violence, ask them about stalking victimization, because so often this is missed. And you may be thinking like, okay, well, you're the stalking lady. I get you care that I call it stalking, but does it really matter? And unsurprisingly, I will argue it does for many reasons, including these. One are your charging and prosecution options. Stalking's not always the most strategic charge. I understand that, but it's also not never the most strategic charge. Most prosecutors like having a menu of options, and it can be quite strategic. And prosecutors love it when they get it, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm generalizing, but if you're charging, let's say, an incident of domestic violence, the court's generally going to try to limit you to that evening. Did the violence happen? Yes or no? If you're charging stalking, you can bring in the entire course of conduct and paint a much fuller picture of just how terrible this offender is. So that, flowers the day I kill you, broke into the house just to leave a weird can of soda, calling all the time, all of that, it haunts me, it haunts you, it haunts judges and juries as well, and paints a much fuller picture. This is not a person with an anger management issue who snapped one day. This is an offender who's chosen to be creepy and terrible many, many times, right? And all of those times are relevant because it's about the course of conduct. And so that can be quite strategic. Also, safety planning. When you see stalking, you want to think about those heightened risks for other forms of intimate partner violence that I already mentioned, right? As well as homicide. If we don't call it stalking, we miss that. And victim empowerment. Even victims like, I don't want to do anything with this. I don't want to talk to the police. I don't want to sit down and make a safety plan. Even just to be able to articulate instead of my ex is being creepy, to be able to say, I'm being stalked. And that's a real thing. And I can look it up, and there's resources available, can go a really long way. And so we need to be identifying stalking, recognizing that most of our stalking survivors who walk through the door are walking through a door that is unlikely to say stalking on it, right? It's more likely to say domestic violence services, sexual assault services, or something else. And so again, we have to draw this out of our victims and survivors because it's quite underreported. So similar to intimate partner violence and sexual violence, about fewer than a third of our victims are reporting to law enforcement, and even fewer are seeking victim services. So you can tell me in the chat why. Why do you think that it is? Why would our victims not pick up the phone and call law enforcement the moment that they're thinking, hey, I'm getting scared here. I think I might need some help. Why not? Why not call law enforcement? Any ideas? Seeing retaliation, yeah, we know our offender might escalate their behavior if they get that call from law enforcement, and so it could make it worse. We know when a protective order is served, for example, that can escalate the offender's behavior. So our victim might feel like, well, they treat me like this when they like me, right? I'm not going to try to get them in trouble and have it be escalated. See a few people saying fear of not being believed. Yeah. Victims are often told you're exaggerating, you're making this up. And with stalking in particular, we love for our victims to keep a lot of evidence, right? So often we say, oh, stalking, show me your documentation log. And we love a documentation log. We have them on our website in 10 languages, very helpful, but also burdensome and not necessarily intuitive for our victims. When most folks get a, say, threatening text message, their instinct might be to delete it because it was upsetting. They don't want to think about it every time they open their phone. So they might feel like, yeah, this happened, but I can't prove it. So what's the point of even reporting it? Um, let's see, the thought of why now? Yeah. Um, secondary trauma being re-victimized. Yeah, that fear of the responder saying you're exaggerating, etc., as well as their internalized sense, like someone's they haven't connected the dots. They don't know it's stalking. They don't know stalking's criminal, and it hasn't occurred to them to go ahead and disclose that. And it's important to note here that fewer than a third of our victims report to law enforcement, and of course, they might also distrust law enforcement. Maybe they had a bad experience in the past, or a friend has, they're from our community, etc. But even fewer victims are going to victim services than to law enforcement. And so I think that's telling as well that our victims don't really know where to go. But to go back to law enforcement for a second, let's say they do report, right? So we know it's underreported. This was a study in the state of Colorado, about 1,800 cases of domestic violence. About 300 involve clear documented evidence of stalking in law enforcement hands. So that doesn't typically happen for all the reasons we just said, right? But here we have 298 cases, evidence of stalking. How many cases do you think were charged as stalking? Like got a stalking charge? It was one. Only one case was charged as stalking. And look, a lot goes into charging decisions. I understand that. It's not always the most strategic charge, but like I said, it's not never the most strategic charge. And so we see this again and again in every similar study that absolutely it's underreported. But even when it is reported, even when we have the evidence, um, we're not necessarily identifying that stalking victimization and holding our offenders accountable. And within victim services as well, we're not always identifying that stalking behavior and safety planning uniquely for our stalking victims. So how do we do better about this? How do we better identify stalking? Well, one is really by asking about stalking behaviors, because typically if you ask someone, are you experiencing stalking? They're likely to say, well, no, it's not stalking, calm down. But if you ask them more specific questions, you're likely to get more information. So we like to use the SLY framework developed by TK Logan. There's so many stalking behaviors. We certainly don't have time to talk about them all, but they generally fall in these categories. And so you can ask about them. Has there been surveillance? Has the offender tracked, followed, or monitored you in any way? Life invasion. Have they invaded your life or privacy with unwanted contact? Um, Interference through sabotage or attack. Have they physically or sexually assaulted you? Have they ever kept you from leaving, held you against your will, caused you to have an accident, or attacked you? And intimidation. Have they intimidated or scared you through threats, property damage, harming of pets, or other means? If they say yes and describe any of these ranges of behaviors, this could be a stalking case, right? And so give some examples of what these might look like. So for example, have they invaded your life with unwanted contact? They might say, I don't know if they've invaded my life. I mean, they text me all the time. Look, they're texting me right now, right? You're likely to get more information. We have a lot of resources on our website to help stalking. I'll go back to that, but this I think can be particularly helpful. It says for law enforcement, but for anyone. This just gives some of the most common stalking behaviors, recognizing they can be done in person and or through technology, and just asking those big questions. How you experience this, and here's some examples of what that might look like, right? This is a great way to screen for stalking pretty quickly. We have more as well. Other checklists, words to listen for, and identifying stalking on calls for service. Again, where stalking may or may not be necessarily named explicitly, but having that lens on and be thinking, could this be a stalking case, can go a really long way. And starting with these basic questions can start you screening for that and assessing what's going on here. Now, if you like those, you'll love the longer version, which is the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile, or SHARP. And so it uses those same foundational questions and then adds to them, right? And so I'd ask, hey, has this happened? Has that happened? How are you feeling about this? Are you worried about that? It only takes about 10 or 15 minutes to complete with the victim, and then it generates a narrative report and risk profile, as well as some safety planning suggestions. It's free, it's online. You can get to it from our website. I highly recommend using this if you're working with a stalking victim or survivor. It can really help you to assess the risk and to clearly articulate what's going on in that case. Of course, risk assessments are wonderful, but our victim perceptions are also very strong. So in other words, if you go through a risk assessment and it says you seem okay and our victim's shaking in fear, there's probably something that didn't capture, right? There is no better risk assessment than a victim's own fear. So Sharp is looking at these 14 risk factors, and I introduced them to you because we're about to watch a video about a stalking case, and I encourage you to look for these risk factors within there. So it's looking at the big picture. What's the course of conduct? What's going on? Does it seem to be escalating? Are there any upcoming triggers, like, say, an upcoming court date? The nature and context of threats. Are they explicit? Are they implicit? Are they public? Are they private? And do we think our suspect could follow through on the threats? The stalker's mindset, as much as we can ascertain it. How is the victim resisted? How is the offender persisted? So the victim got a new phone number, the offender found it. The victim blocked them. They started on, say, Instagram, they started contact assisting. Their motive, and stalker motives can be very difficult to ascertain. When I see a text message thread that says, I love you, I miss you, I hate you, I'll kill you, I'm like, what were your goals there? I'm not sure your stalker could necessarily tell you, but we do know that power and control, entitlement, and rejection are strong motivators. And proxy stalking, which is a fancy way to say stalking through third parties. Are they sending third parties to gather information about and or communicate with the victim? And that's why we so often see stalking continuing even if an offender is incarcerated, because they send a third party to send a message or check up on them. The stalker's history, as much as we know of it. So have they been abusive to the victim or to others? Do they have access to firearms or weapons or any kind of military training? And do they have any criminal history, mental health issues, substance abuse issues? None of those are causing the stalking generally, or at least only in a very small minority of cases, but it can exacerbate the harm there. And victim vulnerability. Stalking is about fear, so are they scared? How is this impacting their life? Do we think technology might be being used, right? And what's their vulnerability in terms of housing, in terms of finances, in terms of physical ability, right? What other factors might be making this person vulnerable? And so for our case scenario today, we're going to look at the Peggy Clinky case. This one, the case is a bit dated. You'll see that from the hairstyles in the video, but it's a really critical one that's foundational to our understanding of stalking, and particularly intimate partner stalking, that I think really illustrates a lot of the concepts that I mentioned today: the escalation, the course of conduct, as well as many of these risk factors. So we're going to watch this video. This first part's about 5 minutes long, and feel free to, in the chat while you're watching, kind of shout out any of the risk factors that you might notice.
It all began in the fall of '98. At the age of 28, my sister Peggy began preparing for medical school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She met and began dating a man named Patrick Kennedy. In the beginning, it seemed like a very fine relationship to me. They were dating, doing dating things, going to movies. But I noticed a switch in Peggy's personality. I just knew something wasn't right with my sister, and I wasn't sure why. Peggy and Patrick's relationship lasted about 3 years altogether. In March of 2002, Peggy cut all ties with him. From the day she left him, he began stalking her, calling her on her cell phone, begging her to come back, threatening her. He waited outside of her work. He waited outside of her gym, just watching her till it was a sort of a sign to let you know that I'm there and I'm watching her every move. He wanted her back in his life, and until he did, he was just going to persist with it. At one point, Peggy had called me in the afternoon and said, "You'll never believe this. Patrick jumped out of the bushes at work with a dozen roses and a wedding ring and asked me to marry him." And Peggy said, "I walked right by him, I got in my car and drove away." Peggy was very, very strong and very determined to shake this man from her life. And the more she ignored him, the angrier he got. Then he progressed to paperwork. He made a really nice 8.5 by 11 flyer with a photo of my sister on it, wrote all sorts of incredible obscenities about her, and put her cell phone number on it, and distributed it where she had her nails done, where she had her hair cut, where her gym was, where she worked.
She took the flyer to the police and showed them that, but there was nothing they can do. It was only a flyer.
But I think at that point, we were still thinking that he was just playing a game. We didn't think it would escalate. And then he took greater steps because she wasn't reacting.
That June, our family gathered in Orlando, Florida for my brother's wedding. Peggy brought a new man she had begun dating, Mark Sparks.
Patrick knew that we would all be in Florida for this wedding. And he had flown to my mother's house in Poland, Ohio, and on her white garage doors with black spray paint, he sprayed "PK is a whore" on the doors.
Patrick then returned to Albuquerque to set fire to Mark's house.
I noticed I had about 8 messages on my cell phone, and I knew something was wrong. So I listened to the messages. My neighbor, my mother, the police, the fire department were all calling and saying that my house was on fire. Right away, Peggy knew that Patrick had done this.
Peggy and Mark were going from hotel to hotel because they had nowhere to live because Mark's house was set on fire. We were at the point we didn't want Peggy to call us because we didn't know if he was trying to trace a phone call. We didn't want him to find out Peggy's whereabouts. Peggy, it seemed for a while, was just in hiding.
Everything that Patrick did to Peggy, Peggy went and reported it to the police. She was getting very, very, very agitated with them because nothing was being done to stop this man from harassing her.
Patrick's behavior was escalating and Peggy got a restraining order. She went to the police and filed for stalking charges. The trial was delayed for several months. Nothing was being done.
It was extremely frustrating. And in a time where you're being hunted by somebody and you feel more victimized by going through the system to protect yourself, then what good is it?
And I remember Peggy coming home having a binder of probably 200-300 pages in it of just everything she had documented. Peggy did all the footwork. Peggy did everything. She did everything right, but nobody would help her. Why? I don't know the answer to that. And at this point, Peggy asked the DA, will it take a bullet to my head for you to do something about this?
With Patrick's behavior escalating, we just felt like, at least temporarily, let's get you out of here. Let's wait for this stalking trial to come up. And by that time, we can determine whether it's safe for you to move back home.
Peggy soon left for Turlock, California to begin a new life. She did everything she could to leave no trace or trail to protect herself.
Right. So even without going into the formal risk assessment, which again, I think is a wonderful tool that I recommend, I see folks in the chat noting a lot of these risk factors that I just pointed out, right? We have the course of conduct with multiple incidents. We see that it's escalating. Mark just used that term to describe Patrick's behavior. His behavior is escalating. When he doesn't get a response one way, he starts doing something else, which also speaks to that resistance and persistence that folks mentioned as well, right? He proposes, she walks right by him. She ignores him, he shows up at the house, right? He just keeps doing things that disrespect her boundaries and persisting. There is a restraining order in place, he is violating it. And in terms of his follow through and capability, well, certainly the arson is very concerning. We're seeing a lot of commitment to this course of conduct happening from Patrick. Now, one thing that doesn't come up in this video is that he had this history of stalking, and about 1 in 3 stalkers have stalked before. He had stalked his former partner. She had tried to get a restraining order. She wrote on the back of it, "He is stalking me. He will not stop until he kills me." But he did stop because he met Peggy, and so he began to stalk somebody different. I don't think he had, I could be wrong about this, I don't think he had a documented criminal history. But it also, when you think about stalking, it reshapes how you might look at some kind of minor charges, right? Because if someone has a history of, say, trespassing, voyeurism, disorderly conduct, well, if that was against the same victim, that was stalking, right? And stalkers are dangerous. And so it could be great greater than the sum of its parts. Does have access to a firearm, though it wasn't mentioned here. And in terms of vulnerability, I mean, I don't think Peggy could be more afraid. She literally said, "Will it take a bullet to my head to stop this?" And if we see the kind of accommodations that she's made, right? She's moving into a different state. She is going from house to house. Peggy was clearly very open to articulating, "This is stalking and I am scared." And that's great. I mean, we want our victims to be able to articulate that. That's helpful to us as responders. But even if she never used that language, look at her behavior, right? She is relocating. She is not talking to her family because they're worried a call will be traced, etc. And we see it escalating and escalating. And so I'm sure it won't surprise you that when we did go through, which we do in longer trainings, the risk assessment with looking for these risk factors with this case, of course, it had a very high score in terms of a lot of the risk factors present. And so now we're going to watch the second piece of this video to see how this turned out. This does include a recording of a 911 call that can be disturbing. So I do want to flag that for folks who might want to step out for that.
6 days before her stalking trial was to happen, Patrick found Peggy after months of searching.
So how did this happen? After paying a private investigator for information, Peggy's stalker drove to the Albuquerque airport, he checked a handgun and a hunting rifle at the airline counter, and flew to San Jose, California. He retrieved his bag with his weapons, rented a car, and arrived at her neighborhood. He posed as a private investigator, approached a delivery driver who recognized her photo, and gave him her exact address.
He caught up with her on her way out of the house early Saturday morning. He duct taped her hands together, he choked her, and he beat her. He beat her so severely with his gun that her blonde hair turned bright red. Despite all of this, Peggy managed to break free and flee to a neighbor's apartment where she was able to call 911.
911 emergency. I have a stalker and he's here to kill me. He's already beat me up and taped me. He's in my house. 1410, number 118 is what he said. Who's there? Patrick Kennedy. He's beating me up with a gun. He's trying to break it now. Does he have a gun right now? He's already beat my head. If you don't get her, he's going to kill both of us. Okay, we're on the way, ma'am. Now. Are they on the way? They're on their way. Quickly. My head is stopping wet with blood. He gets in this house. He's going to kill us. Stay on the line with me, ma'am. I'm staying on the line. Oh, my God. How close are they? They're on their way. Patrick, I'm the only one here. Hey, Leah, please. Stop it. Female. Please, stop it. I actually got to kill me. Ma'am?
The SWAT team arrived. Peggy told them, "If you open this door, he will kill me."
And the police officer said, let's not talk about that, Peggy. Let's talk about your family. And Peggy had said, tell my mother that I love her. And tell my sister who's pregnant to name the baby after me. And tell my niece, Abby, she will have a guardian angel. And those were Peggy's 3 last requests before she was killed.
I just remember punching a hole in one of my walls, and I just, I started crying, and I just said, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry to Peggy, because, at that point you just feel that I failed her, that the whole system failed her. You just feel powerless.
The doorbell rang. I saw 2 police officers. In that instant, I knew they didn't even have to come into the house because I knew what had happened. I said, just tell me, did Patrick Kennedy kill my sister? And what I was told that night was that he had found Peggy, he had shot her in the head with a gun, and then he had killed himself.
So obviously a really, really tragic case, and one that we could see escalating. But I think an important one because it illustrates what is so endemic to these cases, which is that lack of coordination and lack of urgency. There were signs that she was in trouble, but no one was taking it all that seriously besides Peggy and her family, right? And Peggy was never connected with victim services, is one of the major failings here. She was never connected with folks who might have been able to help her get into shelter, get financial resources, etc. And so there was no access to those services that our domestic violence survivors should be getting. And this woman here kind of faded on the screen. This is Debbie Riddle. And she's one of the founders of National Stalking Awareness Month, which is in January because it commemorates the month when Peggy was killed. And so we have, she's done some really incredible activism, and we work with her still in telling Peggy's story and getting the word out and building some real urgency and awareness around stalking. But of course, coming out of this tragedy that I think is partially so upsetting because it's so preventable. And that's what I see in stalking cases all the time. The fact that Debbie said, I knew that Patrick had killed her because she saw it coming. And I can tell you anecdotally, we get emails at Spark all the time, even though we do not do victim services, from people saying, if I die, here's who did it. I just want someone to know. Our victims see it coming, and no one should have to live in that kind of fear. And we all need to be keeping an eye out for the level of urgency and applying the level of urgency here that needs to be applied, because that didn't happen for Peggy. So in terms of responding to victims, I think I've certainly made this point already, but one of the things is just to identify it as stalking. I often hear people talk about, say, breakup violence, or it was a contentious divorce, or they're having a hard time getting over, the fact that she left or he left or they left. And a contentious divorce isn't a crime, but stalking is. And so when it amounts to that level, let's apply that lens to it so that we can hopefully hold those offenders accountable and keep our victims safe. And for those supervising offenders, you may not be supervising a stalking offender, but you might be supervising an offender that is stalking, right? Because we know stalking's undercharged. And so we want to be looking for the diversity of behaviors here to help keep our victims safe as well. The most important pillars here, of course, safety, right? Stalking is dangerous. It's dangerous in terms of physical safety as well as mental health, emotional health. Stalking impacts every part of a victim's life. Often our stalkers, like if you think about Peggy, it's absolutely her physical and bodily harm, but also her new romantic relationship, her job, her home, right? All of that is affected. And so thinking about safety broadly in terms of physical harm, as well as how can this person continue living as normal a life as possible. Connecting them with victim advocacy and really walking them through this imperfect system with a sense of urgency and an eye towards coordination. Documentation. We often tell victims, document, 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 but we don't always tell them how. And so making sure that they have a documentation log and some guidance on best practices for, say, saving evidence, right? And encouraging them to document as things go. And support services that could be financial, housing, emotional, mental health. How can we help our victims best connect with the right places to keep them as safe in all the ways possible? Now, victims cope with stalking different ways. All of these are valid human responses, but some might be more or less intuitive to you and more or less helpful in dealing with the stalker. You have some victims who move against the stalker. So Peggy did this in some ways, that, oh, you're stalking me, you are going to jail, right? I'm going to call the police. I'm taking you down. I am taking action against you. You have others move inward, become very isolated. I'm embarrassed by this. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. I don't want to make it a whole thing. I don't want to put anyone else at risk in my life. I'm going to become isolated. You have others move away. There's anything that creates distance, changing the phone number, changing routes to and from work, relocating, right? Creating that space. You have others who move towards the offender to try to appease them. Okay, they want to talk every day. I'll call them once a week, right? They're trying to negotiate with that offender and keep their enemies closer. And then you have some move outwards, move to folks like you who can help, and that's great. By the time they've done that, they've probably already tried some of these other things. And so it's helpful to ask them, what have they done? So you can meet them where they are and see what's working and what's not working. One piece of advice I want to address is this move away. So this is often guidance given to victims. They're often told, create distance, change your phone number, relocate, seize all contact, block them on everything, right? Separate, separate, separate. And there's a good reason for that. And the reason is that any contact can reinforce the offender's behavior. So if the offender calls 100 times and the victim picks up and says, I hate you, don't call me again, tomorrow they're calling 101 times, right? Because that reinforced the behavior. At the same time, though, that kind of disengagement is not always possible or realistic. And we do see our victims sometimes move towards the offender as, again, that keep your enemies closer. So, for example, there was a case and it came out that the victim had called the stalker at 2 a.m. and they talked for hours. And so, of course, the defense is saying, well, how scared can she be? If she's so scared, why is she calling him, right? And so we asked the victim, and the victim said, yeah, I knew he got off work at the bar at 2 a.m., so I could hear him get in his car, drive home, and fall asleep. I could talk him down and reassure him. So then I knew he wouldn't come over, break my windows, wake my kids up again. That is perfectly reasonable safety planning, right? It's messier, but it might be in the best interest of their safety. And if our victims block our offender on everything, maybe our offender can't see them. They also can't see what the offender's up to and assess their state of mind. And the victim put it to me like this once. They're like, "Did by somebody, don't you want to know where they are?" Kind of hard to argue with that. They want to get that text message saying, I'm coming over so they can leave. Or see on Instagram, oh, they're out of town this weekend. I can relax, right? If they create a wall, it's cleaner from a criminal justice perspective, but it may or may not enhance safety. Speaking of, we know our offenders are likely to escalate when they don't get their way. We saw that in Peggy's case. We see that all the time. So with that no contact, let's play that out for a second. So let's say I'm stalking you and I'm old school. I like to call you on the phone. Okay, so I'm just calling, calling, calling. And eventually you pick up, or no, you don't pick up. You're like, I'm going to change my number. Okay, I cannot with Dana anymore. And so eventually I call you and I get that this number is no longer in service. Am I, the stalker, going to stop stalking and be like, oh, guess I'll become a productive member of society this day? No, I might escalate my behavior because how dare you? I'm definitely going to find your new phone number and I might show up in person. And so we see that, right? It's really both. Yes, advise disengagement and realize that may not always be possible or in the best interest of the victim's safety. We want to know when it's happening because it helps to illustrate that resistance and persistence. But does that necessarily make the victim safer? Maybe, maybe not. And so I encourage you to look at contact in this broader context as well. We have victims getting like messages at the bottom of the screen all the time. The temptation to say, stop it, I hate you, is quite strong. It doesn't mean that the contact is truly mutual, right? So we want to be looking at that as well. If there are hard and fast rules or practices in your jurisdiction where, say, a protective order or no contact order will be dropped if the victim contacts the offender, then make sure your victim knows that, but let's safety plan around it. Let's have dialogue about it. It's not like they did something bad to hide from you, right? They're just doing the best they can to enhance their own safety. When we're safety planning, of course, we want to connect with victim services to do so and make those very individualized safety plans. I should also mention the SHARP assessment creates some larger picture safety guidance as well, but you really want that one-on-one. Big picture here, trust victim instincts. If a victim's afraid, like I said earlier today, they probably have a good reason. And ask the victim how they think the stalker will respond. Safety planning needs to evolve because these cases evolve or devolve, depending how you think of them, right? So your risk assessment and your safety planning is only capturing one moment in time. So we might have to revisit that when things change. And no, we're not psychic. We can't know the future, but as much as possible, let's consider what access or information our offender has about our victim so we can try to anticipate their next tactic and their reaction. Just because they say, haven't shown up at the home yet, doesn't mean they won't. So let's make sure we have a bag packed and an escape plan and a safe place to go. And maybe we also want a camera so we can catch our offender doing that, right? Let's think ahead considering what access their information. Stalker reaction, you have victims who might say, oh yeah, I'd much rather block them on things. That'll make it clear. I'll feel more comfortable using that app. Great. You have others who might say, I'm terrified to do that because then I think they'll show up in person. Okay, that's good to know, right? And that balance of safety and freedom, which is much easier said than done. And letting victims draw their own boundaries around sacrifices they're willing to make and ones they are not. We would all be safer if we stayed home and never left and there were no windows and no internet, right? But most of us don't want to live that way. And so letting victims set their own priorities and that balance of safety and freedom, there's no one right or wrong answer. It's just about what they're willing to do and having them lead that process. Documentation's also critical. We have a log on our website, very succinct, date, time, what happened, where did it happen, the location, because often those jurisdictional issues come up in our stalking case. And if technology was used, what platform? Because getting evidence from Google is different than Apple, is different than Snapchat, etc. If there's witnesses, their information, if evidence is attached, and instruct victims best practices for saving evidence. For example, if it's a screenshot, say, oh, they sent me this text message, tell your victim, hey, slide your thumb over to show the date and time. Take a picture of the contact information so that we can see that the number really is affiliated with that person. When I say this in person, folks often kind of nod like, ah, yes, of course, right? This is not intuitive. And so victims can save evidence, but tell them how. Tell them the best ways to do so. And if they made a report to anyone, if it's law enforcement, great, let's get their name and badge number. But often victims don't understand jurisdiction and may not understand who's really law enforcement or not. So they might say, I told the police, and you drill down, it's like, you told the bouncer at that club, right? That could still be a good witness, though, and they were still scared enough that they told an authority figure, so that's good to know. But also, if they're across state lines, across counties, etc., that information's not always shared in the best way. And so victims might be saying, I told the police, not realizing they're not going to have records to all those reports. And the reality is, even if they do call the exact same department every time, there might be a different responding officer. So when they get that call about, I just got flowers at work, they might kind of roll their eyes and say, you're wasting my time. But to be able to present something like this, and say, hey, this is just the latest in the course of conduct, and here's all the things that have happened and all the other people I've talked to, can go a long way. It's burdensome for victims. It's a lot of work. It's not fair, but it's helpful because these incidents add up, but they only add up if we do the math. Now, a few resources for next steps here, in addition to the ones I pointed out. We are a project of Equitas. They're the prosecutor's resource. And so if you want to talk statute, if you are in a district attorney's office or know others, or your partners are, and they want to talk about strategies for prosecuting stalking, including technology-related stalking, they're free 24/7 technical assistance, so definitely check them out. We also see something I've seen mentioned in the chat, stalking through the courts and or through joint custody. You're absolutely right. And we do have resources on our website about stalking through the courts, as well as supervised visitation and exchange. January Stalking Awareness Month. Again, January in honor of the very story that we looked at today. And so it doesn't always get the same amount of love and attention as, say, October or April. But we really have everything on our website that you need to make it happen. We have daily social media videos, newsletter blurbs you can copy and paste, posters, brochures, really activity ideas for tabling. So definitely check it out. You can see our past campaign, and we'll update it for this coming January soon. And within that, we have a day of action that's actually commemorating the day that Peggy was murdered. And her sister, Debbie, who you saw talking at the end of the video, says about Peggy that she had this sparkling personality. And that as the stalking went on and on, we saw that shine fade. And so the idea here is to bring the sparkle back for Peggy and for all victims and survivors of stalking. And so in addition to doing other acts that day and learning more about stalking, we encourage you to wear something sparkly or shiny and take a picture and post it. Hashtag sparkle against stalking. This is the first ever day specifically focused just on stalking. And I can tell you that Debbie really loves this campaign and finds it very meaningful. It was really exciting to see it take off last year. And so please mark the calendar for this one as well. And our website, you know it, you love it, stalkingawareness.org, where we have so many resources. And I know I keep saying that, but it's really true. Whether you want an infographic on stalking and intimate partner violence to share when you're tabling this month, you can print that right from our website. Or if it's something more nitty gritty, a guide on supervising stalking offenders, we have that too. That being said, we always need more, right? And so if you're not finding something on our website that you need, let us know. That's what we're here for, is to help develop that with and for you. And if you're working on a stalking case and want to talk it through with somebody, we can usually do that as well. We're also free for more training, so you can request a training through our website. In terms of our awareness education, we know most victims don't report, and most victims who do tell someone tell a friend or family member. So how that person responds goes a long way, right? Do they say that sounds like stalking? It's scary. Here's where to get help, or not? A lot of that comes down to what is our public awareness of stalking. So I really encourage you to take a look at those and consider incorporating stalking in your awareness education. Again, our victim resources, handbooks, documentation logs, brochures, etc. And of course, do connect with us so that this can stay top of mind year round. Here's my contact information. I just want to thank you so much for your attention and for all of your good work and for your participation in the chat. I know it's easy for me to sit here and say, hey, think about this, consider that, use this tool, right? But you're the ones actually on the ground trying to keep victims safe, accountable. It is all easier said than done, and I completely understand and respect that. So truly thank you for the work that you do, and don't hesitate to contact us. I hope this has helped you better consider stalking in how it relates to intimate partner violence, and don't hesitate to reach out for more training, etc. I know I'm about out of time here. I see some questions. I understand our interpreters may or may not be able to stay on, but I'll pull them up and see if I can answer a couple real quick here, understanding if folks have to go. But thank you all again so much for joining. All right, I'm going to open up the Q&A. Someone asked, is there an app to check if spyware is on the phone? So we do have more resources on the use of technology to stalk. There's no one and done app. There is something called ChinyCheck from Kaspersky. However, it needs to be run on its own computer on a Linux system. And so look that up and see if that can help. That being said, there's no one catch-all, unfortunately, for finding that. Let's see. Direct link for the Sly screener. Yeah, hopefully Emma can put that in the chat. We do have those questions that on our website if you look under identifying stalking behaviors. Let's see. hold on a second. Someone asked, let's see. Was the private investigator in Peggy's case held accountable for tracking her down? I don't believe so, because I don't believe he knew he was helping an offender in this sense. Usually private investigators can't be held accountable if they're acting in their course of, professional duty, but they can be really good witnesses. And so I don't know the details on this particular case. How do we get law enforcement to care about stalking and not ignore us and brush us off? I mean, if there is one answer, I would give it to you, right? But I think, we do a lot of training for law enforcement through Spark, and so certainly they have to invite us in, right? We can't make people do our training, but we have a lot of really practical resources, and we will co-train with detectives and former detectives, etc. And I think it's really getting folks to recognize that these stalkers really are dangerous. It's not just an annoyance. It's not an innocuous thing. And also that stalking really can be quite strategic in terms of holding those offenders accountable. This isn't touchy-feely stuff, right? It's about homicide. It's about often committing other crimes. And speaking of other crimes, recognizing that if you can't charge stalking, you can charge something a lot of the time, right? Because most offenders commit, I don't know if most, but many offenders commit multiple crimes in their course of conduct. So if it's trespassing, if it's voyeurism, if it's harassment, right? Let's build that so that we keep adding to the course of conduct. Maybe it becomes a stalking case, or maybe we're only, addressing those other behaviors, recognizing behaviorally that it's stalking, but it's not accountability all or nothing, right? We can have accountability for these crimes. And I also encourage law enforcement. Sometimes I think they feel really like their hands are tied, like, yeah, this is happening, it's bad, but I can't charge stalking right now. I don't have the evidence, I don't have enough. And so, what I'd encourage is it's all in the response, and especially in that first response. What a lot of victims hear is, there's nothing I can do, come back when someone tries to hurt you. And that's not appropriate, right? What we can say instead is something more along the lines of, I'm glad you told me, you were right to come in. I'm taking a report. I'm going to write this down. I can't go out and make an arrest today with what you've given me, but I want to get you started with the documentation log. I'm going to connect you with victim services. Here's who you call if anything else happens, and do you have a safe place to go right now? That feels really different than nothing I can do, this is nothing, right? Even if you can't make a charge or arrest or what have you that moment. And so validating it and taking the report. And we also encourage victims and victim advocates, if someone's not taking it, keep asking, keep escalating it until someone at least takes the report, so that if something else happens, we're not starting from square one. There's some documentation already, right? And so again, I don't think that fixes all the problems, but at least that's a few things to consider in terms of law enforcement response. And of course, tell them to come get a training from Spark. We'll be happy to chat with them. All right, so I think I'm about out of time here, so I will let y'all go. Thanks to Emma for sharing those resources. Thank you for sticking with me through some Q&A. And to NCJ, FCJ for hosting. Appreciate you all giving your time and attention to this, and for all the good work that you do. So please keep in touch with us and have a wonderful rest of your Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So